Hello, I'm Francisco Camacho with WRGW's PINDROP. I'm speaking right now with Dr. Jennifer Cooke. She is the director of the Institute for African Studies here at the George Washington University. Dr. Cooke, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I want to start here in regards to Burkina Faso because I was watching a clip from The Daily Show last September, and Trevor Noah makes this point that is, to be fair, pretty reflective of a lot of history. Because, whoever starts this September coup after the January coup must be hoping that everyone can agree that that's enough coups. There's always this concern of like that coups become a self-perpetuating environment of more coups. Are you concerned that that could be happening in Burkina Faso? I mean, it's not like these are the first two either. There have been roughly 8, I think, since independence.
Yeah, in fact, there have been 9 since independence, and of one popular uprising that ousted long-serving Blaise Compaoré. But yes, I do feel that this could become a regular feature of Burkinabe politics, in part because the rationale by the military, which is quite divided, behind the coups is that not enough is being done to address the security situation, but the security situation since these coups has deteriorated even further. And so the current leader has very little popular legitimacy, and continued deterioration of the security situation, I fear, will only lead to more people kind of trying to throw their hat in the ring from the military.
Speaking of the idea of the security situation as some of the justification, we've seen just earlier this month, actually, from the current prime minister, apologies for mispronunciations here, Kielem de Tambela, in a visit to Mali, expressing a desire to create a flexible federation between Burkina Faso and Mali. And one of the reasons he cited for doing it and doing it urgently is that when politicians become involved again, things get a bit more sticky. Of course, the two countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, are currently under military juntas who've shared a front in fighting against jihadist Islamist terrorist groups in both of those countries. Do you see the prospects for this federation as anything real? A federation like this has been tried once before at the tail end of French colonial rule.
Yeah, I imagine perhaps some kind of an alliance. A genuine federation is harder for me to imagine. I just the sovereignty of both matters, but they are, like you said, very similar in kind of outlook. Military juntas, both possibly. Mali currently receiving support from Moscow and the Wagner Group. Burkina denies it, but seems to be flirting with the idea of bringing Russia and potentially the Wagner Group in. So you might see kind of an alliance to of the two governments in seeking to fight off the jihadist threat.
So we've talked a bit about the instability of the situation, the security continuing to deteriorate. But when these changes of governments happen, as we saw last year, it's not always a guarantee that the new government will be democratic. To what extent do you see the changes that come in the future leaning back towards something that was more nominally democratic, like what we saw before the January 2022 coup? To what extent do you see it being these factions of the military just trying to establish more power within the junta itself?
I think Burkina is in a very difficult and kind of bleak moment right now, because it's clear that the security situation is not coming under control anytime soon. Even were they to turn to external groups like the Wagner Group, there's no guarantee, as we see in Mali, that violent attacks will diminish. The other issue that I see is the promise or the agreement to begin to arm vigilante groups or self-protection groups, so-called. And, last month we saw one of these government-allied militias kill 80 Fulani, children, women as well, in Western Burkina Faso. And when you see that and kind of these local groups being kind of targeted both by the jihadis and by the government, you worry that this conflict may become kind of ethnicized as well, and divided. A country where, traditionally ethnicity was not a huge polarizing issue, nor was religion for that matter. And now you see these divides widening, and potentially violently. So that's a concern. It would take a particular kind of leader to try to reestablish some kind of social compact and that brings these multiple groups together. And that's hard in a democracy.
Right. Just a quick clarification, when we're talking about these security threats, we're talking predominantly about these insurgent Islamist jihadist groups that are operating in Burkina Faso and Mali, correct?
Yes, well, that's the prime vector of instability. But as I said, the government is also kind of arming local vigilante groups to fight the jihadists. But that can turn into kind of these kind of indiscriminate attacks on opposing ethnic groups, as happened in January.
To your knowledge, has the current government, the current junta, given any indication that they are promising or are intending to hold elections anytime soon?
I would not hold them to any promise that I would not hold my breath for elections anytime soon. And I guess we'll see if we get to that point. It does help restore their legitimacy within the African Union and with the international community to move to transitions. But the idea that they would be free and fair, I think is kind of far-fetched at this point.
I want to now turn just to focus in again on these insurrection, the insurgent groups that we're seeing that are leading to all these, that are the primary reason for all of these security concerns, as we've addressed. When we think, I think when we think of the West, of the idea of Islamist or jihadist terrorism in the West, we often have in mind the Middle East. We think of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We think of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Can you help us understand just how prevalent this security threat is in Burkina Faso right now? How prominent are these groups? How much of an impact are they having?
It's fairly significant in a fairly small country. And as I say, it's getting worse. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies just came out with a report that in the last year alone, attacks in Burkina, fatalities increased 69%. And that shows no sign of abating. The groups are Islamic State in the Greater Sahel, which is an ISIL linked group, and elements of JNIM, which is something of an Al-Qaeda linked group. And those groups have been expanding their geographic reach. They are now attacks in northern Cote d'Ivoire, in Benin as well. So it's really regionalizing rapidly and proliferating in a alarming way.
And I do actually want to turn lastly to this regional aspect. We've discussed, of course, the relations with Mali a decent bit already. But as far as the rest of West Africa, and really even the international community more largely, what are we seeing as the strongest reactions to the current government in Burkina Faso as a whole?
From the international community?
Yeah, I guess. Sorry, you're right. Let's start with the international community as a whole. Europe, like the United States, China, and then I'll go more regional after that.
Well, because the leader came to office in a coup, the U.S. kind of cannot provide legally military support. He was not invited to the Africa Leader Summit, for example, this past December. Suspension from the African Union. He's kind of been in a spat with the Ghanaian president, who accused him of inviting Wagner in. And he's relationships with the French are obviously at a real low. And French troops are withdrawing, the French ambassador left. On the other hand, the prime minister in December, as I said, was in Moscow, meeting with the foreign minister there, possibly meeting with Wagner. And the president, the so-called president, has been invited to the next Africa-Russia summit. So there is, Russia is making a strong play for Burkina Faso, in part through this kind of diplomacy, in part through disinformation and propaganda campaigns, some of which are quite crude, but clearly somewhat effective, to turn and to kind of play into that existing resentment of France, and expand Russia's influence and commercial opportunities.
So just a quick follow-up on that. The main reason, because this was quite relatively big news for Burkina Faso, is the eviction of French troops who were there to help with the Islamist insurgencies that we were seeing from these groups, which you have named. Is the decision to do this primarily because of nationalist sort of political reasons, this resentment of the former colonizer being there, or is it also more practical in relation to performance in combating these groups?
I think it's both. Obviously, there's always been the simmering resentment against the former colonial power. Burkinabe suspect that the French had a hand in the assassination of Thomas Sankara, the great popular Burkinabe revolutionary, and a supporter of Compaoré, who ruled for 27 years. So there is an existing precondition for antipathy to the French, and frustration that their presence and their military presence has yielded no results. And so, like in Mali, the idea that they've been there for how many years now, and the situation is only getting worse. I think many think, what do we have to lose by going with Russia? I will say, though, that, Russia has identified that, and kind of these campaigns of propaganda have kind of effectively played into that already existing narrative.
Dr. Cooke, thank you for taking us so much through these events in Burkina Faso, helping us to break these down. I want to just end with letting our listeners know a little bit about what you're going to be up to soon. We at PINDROP will be doing special coverage in a couple of weeks about the Nigerian election, and I understand that you're going to be doing some activities related to that.
Yes, I'm going to be an elections observer in Nigeria for the February 23rd election. It's kind of a tense and close competition, I believe. We have a former alumni who will also be there, Max Bone, who is working for the International Republican Institute. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. There have been a number of security concerns, but I think it will be a very close fought contest that some predict may ultimately go to a runoff, which for an observer would be a little disappointing, but that's the nature of the electoral process. But yeah, I'd love to be in touch during the process.
We'd love to hear from you as we do our special on that. And as the news department coverage, the day after, on Saturday, the day of the elections, we'll be running special coverage about the Nigerian elections. Hopefully we'll hear some more from you then. Best of luck in Nigeria, and please stay safe while you're there. And, for your sake, I hope it's not a runoff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooke.
It was a pleasure. Take care.